John Paul II was an extremely charismatic spiritual leader.
There was just such a joy in him that was present that you could see.
He had an intensity about life and an intense love for people. I mean, he intensely loved people. That's what he was driven by.
He was an academic, an amazing academic, but also did a lot of work with families.
He's like everybody's grandpa.
John Paul II has been a presence of Christ, really, on earth.
One newspaper reporter in Denver called him God's ambassador to the United States.
He wasn't just a pope, he was a pastor. He was not a person that was above the people.
He was just so able to put you at ease in his presence.
When the Holy Father landed somewhere, it's like 900 square miles of grace just settled on the city.
World Youth Day is the largest gathering of Catholic young people in the world. And in 1993, all of those people from all over the world came to Denver, and the Pope joined them.
Colorado Experience is made in partnership with History Colorado,
inspiring generations to find wonder and meaning in our past and to engage in creating a better Colorado. HistoryColorado.org.
with funding provided by the University of Denver, celebrating 150 years, the Denver Public Library, the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations and viewers like you. Thank you.
Pope John Paul II came into the world a man named Karol Wojtyla. He was born in 1920 in Poland. His mother died when he was a small child. His brother died when he was a teenager. His father died when he was in his early 20s. He lost his entire family right as the Nazis are occupying Poland, where he lives.
John Paul II understood the worst of humanity. This is a person who survived Nazi Germany. This is a person who knew the ghettos of Warsaw. This is a person who saw people starve to death, who were murdered in front of him.
He was hunted by the Nazis. He hid in a closet while they were searching his apartment at one point. He studied in an underground seminary because seminaries were forbidden under the Nazis.
So there was an intensity in him about human life and the preciousness of human life, because he knew the abyss. He'd been there. And so that's what shaped him, that's what formed him.
There came a point where they had to actually move into the seminary full-time in hiding because they were being hunted. So these are the conditions under which he became a priest.
Coming up in Poland, being a pastor and being a bishop and then an archbishop and then a cardinal, he had pastoral experience. He wanted to be out talking to people and bringing the church to them.
He became Pope in 1978, and it was a very interesting time in the church. When Pope Paul VI died, all the cardinals came to the Sistine Chapel, and Cardinal Wojtyla of Poland was one of those cardinals. And they came and they elected a pope who took the name John Paul I. 30 days later, he suddenly died. And they're all back in the Sistine Chapel. When this second gathering happened after the death of John Paul I, when the Pope is elected, the white smoke comes out of the Sistine Chapel, and then the Cardinal makes the announcement, Cardinal Wojtyla, and everybody's looking at everybody saying, who?
I mean, I can still remember exactly where I was when John Paul II was elected Pope. I remember sitting with a priest friend of mine, and we were watching, and both of us looked at each other and said, Wojtyla, where's he from, Africa? And they said, no, he's from Poland.
This beautiful, radiant young man comes out. He's 58, which in the world of the papacy is quite young. And he begins speaking in perfect Romani, in perfect Roman Italian, so that they all went crazy. And that was the beginning of the world church's love affair with Karol Wojtyla.
It is a tradition of the Church that in the moment in which a pope is elected, that he may choose another name. So he chose John Paul II to continue also the legacy, I believe, of John Paul I.
One newspaper reporter in Denver called him God's ambassador to the United States. And he was seen as somebody with a strong following, with a strong message, a man who was very good at inspiring people, inspiring young people.
He was very charismatic, and people responded to that. Young people particularly responded to that. And he delighted in the young people, and you felt that.
The whole idea for World Youth Day was John Paul II. He really felt called to reach out to the youth, because not that they were the church of tomorrow, but because they're the young church of today. So he got this idea in 1984. Let's get a bunch of teenagers together. And they held the first one in Rome in 1986. They had it on their home tour first, and then they said, this is so successful, let's take it on the road. And they did.
World Youth Day is the largest gathering of Catholic young people in the world. And in 1993, all of those people from all over the world came to Denver, and the Pope joined them.
John Paul II was seen as a rock star around the world, and this was sort of a personal tour. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people traveled from all around the world to see the Pope, to become energized about their faith, to dedicate themselves to living better lives, and to sort of bask in the celebration of their church.
Pope John Paul II was the one who had approached the bishops of the United States and asked if they would be willing to consider hosting a World Youth Day event in the United States. And then they began to look at various cities throughout the country that had not yet hosted a papal visit. Those cities included Buffalo, New York, Denver, Colorado, Seattle, Washington, and a few others. Archbishop Stafford called me from Washington and said, "Are you seated? What would you think about hosting Pope John Paul II on a papal visit?" I said, "The Pope's coming back to the United States." He said, "Well, yes, specifically for World Youth Day in the summer of 1993. I said, "You bet I'm seated, because I remember watching the video of the last one in Czestochowa, and it was a mess. You mean to say that that mess could be coming to Denver?" He said, "If you want it." I said, we should go for it. We should want it.
Denver is the West. It's a new center of youth. It is the most vibrant city. And the Pope is looking to talk with young people. So to evangelize in the United States, Denver becomes the center. And also, as he said, the mountains are a cathedral. What better place for the Pope to come to God's cathedral than Colorado?
There were two main reasons why the Pope selected Denver as the site of World Youth Day in 1993. The first was the landscape, the scenery, the great backdrop of the Rocky Mountains he felt was very inspiring. The other reason was the growing Hispanic population of Denver and of Colorado. Hispanic Catholics were the largest growing segment of that community. And although the Pope could have gone to many Latino countries, reaching out to Latinos in the United States was very important to his papacy.
So when I heard he was coming to Denver, which is my hometown, and to speak specifically to youth, that was exciting. Just to be recognized, I mean, in the church and just in the United States, out of every city, you know, we're not Los Angeles, we're not Boston, we're not New York.
Will young people really come from all over the world to Denver, Colorado? Even some of the bishops within the United States were skeptical.
People in the church didn't know how this was going to go. You know, was it going to flop? I mean, the state isn't 100% Catholic. Who would have said that the largest gathering in the history of this state was going to be around a pope?
I remember that there had been lots of press about how, you know, the Holy Father's coming, and we don't really think it's going to be much of a success because he's old and this is a youth event, and that was not the experience at all, at all. Thousands of people came, the largest gathering ever in Colorado history.
There were well over 750,000 who showed up for the World Youth Day.
Nobody really knew what to expect in Denver from the arrival of the Pope and hundreds of thousands of people following him. It was the largest event that Denver had ever hosted at all. Of course, there was great anxiety with the Pope's arrival because Denver in 1993 was a very violent place. We were going through the summer of violence in which more than 130 murders took place over the course of the summer. There was a lot of gang violence, there was a lot of domestic violence, and it felt to city authorities like Denver was a little bit out of control. And nobody really knew how this phenomenon of increased homicides and the arrival of the Pope were really going to come together.
It was becoming an international news story. We were receiving phone calls asking if it was safe to send their children, hearing that there was so much gang-on-gang violence and so many killings that were taking place.
We actually had a drive-by shooting happen on our street. It was a terrifying experience. And I heard a car speeding down the street. It went by our house, and I heard gunshots, and I heard people yelling. I'm like watching this out my kitchen window, like it's on TV or something. It was the summer of violence. It was a scary time.
People were really worried about the Pope coming here because of the violence, and they were worried about an uptick in violence and what would happen.
When the Holy Father arrived, it was incredible that all this violence came to a screeching halt.
Crime went to zero. There was no violence. You can call that whatever, but some people said it's a miracle.
There was no summer of violence. It was a week of amazing grace.
This was the largest mass influx of people in Denver in our history.
The largest number of international delegates was virtually a tie, if you will, between the Italians and the Mexicans. But there were also small delegations from very far corners of the world, including Australia, New Zealand, the South Pacific.
You could have heard 70 different languages. There were people coming from Angola and Argentina, and certainly Spain and Italy. We became a global society in the summer of 1993. It was a major organizational effort to make sure that the travelers who came here from around the world were safe and comfortable and had the basic amenities that they needed in order to celebrate their event.
We had to provide transportation, housing, room and board, and so on and so forth for 250,000 people. And that was my job. I only lost sleep over it one night, and that was, how am I going to house all of these people?
They were expecting thousands of pilgrims. Organizers knew they wouldn't have enough housing. Even though we had this tiny little house, I was excited about offering our house to someone who would need shelter. When I opened the door, the first one was the Carmelite priest, and he introduced himself to me, and his name was Father Angel. I thought that was beautiful. I thought that was just lovely.
We did use the entire Auraria parking garage to house all of the Italian delegates who came. But it was open air. It was warm enough at night for them to sleep, to camp out in a parking garage in the middle of downtown Denver. They loved it.
World Youth Day was really a 5-day event that spanned from Wednesday, August 11th to Sunday, August 15th, 1993. Celebrations began even before the Pope arrived. On the Wednesday before he arrived, there was a large celebration and a mass at Civic Center Park, which they renamed Celebration Plaza in the Pope's honor.
The call came in that the young people were frolicking in the fountains of Civic Center Park, which you would expect young people to do on a hot day. However, that presented quite a liability concern for us should someone be injured, and our insurance people required that we shut that down, and so they drained those fountains of water. Not a lot of happy young people on that day.
The following day, the Pope arrived at Stapleton International Airport, where he was greeted by the President of the United States, Bill Clinton.
President Clinton came to greet the Holy Father upon his arrival here. They had a summit of some length, an hour, hour and a half, at Regis University.
On Friday, the Pope celebrated a Mass at the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, renamed the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception by the Pope.
There was an extraordinary sense of joy and satisfaction and relief that the event was finally here and it was taking place.
When Pope John Paul II decided on Denver, one of the things he wanted to do was to go to the mountains.
He retreated to Camp St. Malo, a beautiful church on the slopes of Long's Peak for meditation and reflection. After his visit to the Rocky Mountains, he returned to Denver for an evening service at Mile High Stadium, and it was one of the sublime moments of his entire visit is 90,000 cheering young people went on and on and on in their celebration of the Pope.
Just hearing the roar when the helicopters started to come in carrying Pope John Paul, the pressure of the noise against the helicopters themselves, it jolted the helicopters a couple times.
When he came into Mile High, it was an amazing moment. There was this feeling in there of being overwhelmed by something people hadn't felt before.
We are in Denver. We are in Denver. Denver, Colorado.
All eyes are on this one guy. You catch a glimpse of him and you cry, and it's just this, it's the reaction to holiness. It was awesome, and it was just to be with that many other people.
I mean, the place was packed. It was a wholly different motivation for being there and a wholly different feeling. Nobody had gone into Mile High Stadium for this reason. People hadn't seen before, they hadn't experienced that before in Denver. And he got in the Pope Mobile.
The Pope Mobile is a car that is custom made to carry basically the Holy Father amongst the crowds.
It was an automobile with an open top and then a sort of a plexiglass, a shield around the Pope. A very unusual car. Nobody else in the world drove one like the Pope.
It does allow the Holy Father to walk through the crowd.
The Pope Mobile was trying to create a balance between allowing him exposure with the people but also protecting his bodily person. And then on Saturday, tens of thousands of young people took a pilgrimage to Cherry Creek State Park on the southeastern fringe of Denver.
The pilgrimage is an ancient form of Christian spirituality. Perhaps the simplest way to define it is walking prayer. It worked out very well, though, for the city and county of Denver because the Cherry Creek ran from downtown Denver to Cherry Creek Reservoir.
You can imagine this lake and in a lovely setting of the Rocky Mountain backdrops. A beautiful, beautiful summer day. Hot.
Very hot. You know, it's August. The sun was beating down.
It was long. 13 miles is a long pilgrimage for anyone to make.
It was a pilgrimage, and it was hard. You know, there are many challenges on a pilgrimage. Even if it's through the city, there were just people everywhere. It was an arduous but beautiful experience.
So we got up very early in the morning and we began walking, and I remember more and more people were walking with us, wanting to share the same experience, faith experience, and wanting to have an encounter with God, because at the end, really, this is what we were all seeking. And the experience was really beautiful, to encounter young people from all over the world.
People started showing up, you know, overnight. There was a pilgrimage, the walk out there. And prior to the Pope getting there, you see this in third world countries, you see this sometimes at pilgrimages to religious sites, but you had priests who were sitting in chairs, and you had a person, a penitent, sitting next to them, and they were hearing confessions. And you saw this all over the park, and it was an amazing, pretty amazing sight, because in the United States you hardly ever see that. Then you saw people who you know, had camped out, you know, disheveled people getting out of their, you know, at dawn, getting out of their sleeping bags.
It's like the Catholic Woodstock, you know. It was just this enormous mass of humanity.
Crowds were estimated at well over 800,000 there. Some even said there were close to 1 million, but it was just amazing to see that kind of mass of people.
It was very orderly, people were enjoying themselves, almost like a Sunday picnic. But you know, with 800,000 people, and of course with all the requisite issues, you know, where are the restrooms?
When his helicopter did get there, I was standing in a bathroom line that I'd been in for like an hour, and I'm like, I am not leaving this line. I'm just gonna wave. I'll just be one of the little tiny dots down here waving at him.
And it was crazy because you had every age from everywhere. I saw everybody. I saw a cross-section of ages, a cross-section of cultures. And everybody's got the one thing in common, is we all love JP2, and a lot of them are only in that moment discovering how much they love JP2. So a lot of people were having a real moment.
It did change my life. I remember one distinct moment in which he was speaking, and he began to say that it was necessary, urgent, to go and announce the love of God to everyone.
And the mission of proclaiming it to the ends of the earth is now passing to your generation.
And I remember in that moment, clearly and distinctly, I began to think about my life and see that everything that I was doing didn't have really a deep meaning. And in that moment, the words of the Holy Father really struck my heart.
Have no fear. Have no fear.
And in that moment, I also felt for the first time a strong call from God to become a priest. And little did I know that eventually I would have been ordained priest for the Archdiocese of Denver. So it all started with John Paul II in 1993, and that experience is still present in my life. I cannot detach myself from that World Youth Day.
For a lot of people, it was a conversion moment, and you can talk to so many priests who can trace their priesthood, their vocation, back to World Youth Day.
World Youth Day produced fruit here, and certainly the Holy Father himself said he was even surprised by the response of the people here and the young people here. And he considered it a revolution.
And it was a revolution. It was a revolution for the new evangelization, for taking the gospel into the third millennium.
The message stayed. It wasn't just a moment, it wasn't just a rah-rah, we love Jesus, but so many lay people who found their faith, so many different things sprung out of it.
The World Youth Day strengthened the church in metropolitan Denver. It left a positive lingering effect in bringing people together in the Catholic Church in Colorado.
I think the Pope and World Youth Day really provided the leaven for the bread for the community. The Catholic community here after World Youth Day became energized.
The impact on Denver was huge. The vitality of the church before and after World Youth Day was like two completely different cities, different environments, different experiences. It really started taking off after that.
There are 2 seminaries in Denver, which is unheard of, and they're packed. They are packed with young men who want to be priests.
There is an abundance of ordinations, really. And these 2 diocesan seminaries, for example, are a fruit of the visit of John Paul II.
The Holy Father made it very clear that he felt God was leading him to Denver, and that Denver was going to be a center. And that has turned out to be the case.
Denver is the center of the new evangelization of the Catholic Church in the United States. And it remains that.
Oh come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel.
Something changed, for sure, after 1993. His health began to deteriorate.
He found it very important not to hide his suffering, to show the world that it's okay to be old, that it's okay to be feeble, that we still have dignity. He didn't want to be one who was just kind of shut off.
To see him weak has shown even more his strength, his spiritual strength.
We saw the ravage of the Parkinson's on his speech, on his demeanor, on his face, and he was out on the balcony blessing the crowds very shortly before he died.
He died in April 2005. Emotionally, it was a loss, but at the same time, I felt that the whole church was gaining a saint.
During his funeral, it was just so beautiful, and the crowd saying "Sainthood now."
People were already holding posters, Santo Subito, saint immediately.
We all believed he was a saint. So the church is just affirming in an official way what we already knew.
I was so excited when I heard that the canonization process was starting and that he was going to be Saint John Paul II. He certainly changed my life in enormous and profound ways.
I did feel that he spent his life for me, and this is a sign of love.
John Paul II was one who always made his visitor to feel welcome and important. It was said many, many times by many, many people that when they were in the presence of Pope John Paul II, it was as if there was no one else in the world. And that really was a gift that he could offer.
He was able to transmit this. And this is what impacted probably so much. For sure, he changed the way the Pope is perceived.
He was the first Pope rock star. Up until then, popes were old guys in Rome and wonderful holy men, but certainly youth didn't know who they were. They were just these guys who made pronouncements, and he was your grandfather. I mean, he reached out, he came to us, and he loved us. I mean, that was completely new.
Pope John Paul II was one of the most influential popes that we've had in the modern era. He shaped the course of the Catholic Church in ways that will be around for generations.
John Paul II represents what saints, I think, really are. They're people who do absolutely their best.
There's much hope, there's much good, there's much love that has come from World Youth Day. There's much to be positive, to be hopeful, to look forward to in the future that World Youth Day can hand on as a legacy from Pope John Paul II to the city of Denver, to the people of Colorado, and to the world.